Hey guys, tonight we're going to unveil a story that history has tried to bury. Lying deep within the cold ground of an ancient cathedral, a lead coffin has rested in silence for centuries. Not for peaceful rest, but to hide a chilling truth. When the doors to the royal vault were finally opened, historians found more than just the remains of a queen. They came face to face with a horror so profound it would make even the most seasoned experts shudder. This is the story of Queen Elizabeth I, the woman who defied the world, vanquished a mighty fleet, and built an empire. But what they found inside that coffin wasn't a trace of a golden age, but a twisted, ruined relic, preserved by a gruesome, embalming ritual. The great queen had become a grotesque monument to the brutality of death, a secret that, to this day, very few people know. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Please comment below and let me know where you are and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the dim, hushed depths of Westminster Abbey's underground vault, a single lead coffin lay undisturbed for centuries. No torchlight had ever dared to pierce its silence, and no hand had ever dared to lift its lid until a fateful day when archaeologists, guided by rumor and the faint hope of revelation, finally received the order to pry it open. The air in that subterranean chamber was heavy with dampness, a musty scent that clung to stone walls like a whispered secret. Every footstep echoed with the promise of something darker than any macabre legend, for it was said that beneath those ancient arches lay a truth so horrifying it would rend the veil of time itself. When the lead lid was finally forced aside, the researchers did not discover a queen in peaceful repose. Instead, they uncovered a scene of ritualized violence, so grotesque it seemed born of nightmare rather than history. Within that narrow metal box lay the remains of a woman once celebrated as an indomitable monarch, she who had stood unyielding against the greatest naval armadas and inspired poets with her iron resolve. Yet there she lay, her body brutally disfigured, the chest cavity grotesquely hollowed, organs removed with clinical precision, and her brain extracted through the nasal passage in a desecrating ceremony. The empty torso, once the vessel of her formidable will, had been stuffed with pungent herbs and spices, an attempt at preservation that rendered the corpse into a perverse banquet of decay. Casting our minds back to the spring of 1603, we find Elizabeth, Queen of England, in her final days at Richmond Palace. The autumn of her life had turned bitter and frail. Yet even as her strength waned, she refused to succumb to the humiliation of a bed. For days, nay, weeks, she stood upon trembling legs, supported by loyal attendants, a living testament to her own unbending spirit. She feared more than death's touch. She feared the moment she laid down her crown. Whispered rumours swirled through the corridors of the court, tales of the queen haunted by visions of rot and posthumous vivisection. In her clearest hours, she had begged that her body be left intact, that no scalpel or rod should violate the sanctity of her remains. Yet her pleas were swept aside, a tragic echo of royal decree. As dusk fell on the day of her passing, March 23rd, 1603, the palace halls were filled with a grim hush. Elizabeth finally gave in to exhaustion, collapsing in silence. At 3 o'clock before dawn on March 24th, she drew her last breath. Only a handful of servants bore witness, bound by duty more than devotion. Almost immediately, the clandestine embalming ritual commenced. Under the wavering light of guttering candles, surgeons made the first incision below her rib cage, feeling the tense pressure as air escaped in a fetid hiss. The stench that followed was suffocating, a sickly sweet blend of decay and spice that no amount of incense could disguise. Next came the brain, her brilliant mind, once the keystone of an empire, now reduced to a grey slurry. A hollow iron rod, thrust through the nasal cavity, shattered bone and liquefied memory, each chunk of tissue drawn out in trailing filaments of gore. The heart, too, was removed for study, its chambers denuded of blood, revealing the ravages of years spent under the strain of rulership. And then, to mock the piety of royal funerary rites, the queen's body was packed tight with rosemary, frankincense, myrrh, and other resins meant to purify, but in fact to intensify the chamber's noxious brew. A final indignity awaited. The coffin of Mary, Queen of Scots, Elizabeth's half-sister and lifelong rival, was lowered atop her own. Thus, Two sisters who had battled for the soul of England were reunited at last, not in peace or reconciliation, but in a cramped chamber of silence and torment. In life, they had vied for crowns. In death, their battered remains lay stacked like refuse, a grim testament to the transient nature of power. In the light of dawn, the palace gates opened to herald Elizabeth's state funeral. Crowds lined the streets, their mournful faces illuminated by torches, while nobles in solemn procession carried the black-draped carriage toward London. An effigy of the Queen, an eerily lifelike wax figure, rested upon the coffin, its features composed to serene repose. But behind the facade of dignity, the corpse inside was roiling with chemical reactions of decomposition, a sealed cauldron of putrefaction. Strange noises, hisses, gurgles escaped through tiny breaches in the lead. Attendants, hoping to quell the sounds, pierced the coffin walls with slender rods, then quickly resealed the wounds, though the eerie symphony persisted. Thus ended the life of one of history's most formidable queens, only to begin a posthumous chapter more horrifying than her fiercest foes could have devised. The lead coffin descended into the vault beneath Westminster Abbey, and there it lay, a nexus of tragedy and taboo, the decaying heart of a kingdom's golden age, forever entombed in its own fetid legacy. The story of the Tudor royal death remained hidden in silence for centuries, too horrifying ever to be shared in open daylight. Only in the year 1868, when the spirit of Victorian exploration mingled with a daring curiosity for the past, did Bishop Arthur Stanley, under mounting pressure from antiquarians and scholars, grant permission to reopen the vault at Westminster Abbey. That autumn afternoon, a team of experts descended into the gloom, armed with lanterns, chisels, and rudimentary breathing apparatus. They approached the first lead-lined iron coffin with trembling hands, and as the workmen drilled a small hole to inspect its contents, a fetid plume of rancid air erupted forth. It was a stench so overpowering that the assembled party hastily donned crude cloth masks soaked in vinegar, hoping to stave off the nausea that threatened to overwhelm even the steadiest constitution. As the air settled into an uneasy calm, the researchers peered through the breach and recoiled at what they saw. Bones of one or two generations of royalty lay jumbled together in thick, clinging mud, the result of centuries of water infiltration from the ancient stonework above. Sludge seeped from every crack, pooling at their boots like a morbid testament to neglect and decay. The scene before them resembled the most nightmarish Gothic fable, a buried necropolis where the dead stirred in perpetual unrest. Beneath the collapsed remains of Mary Tudor's coffin, tipped on its side and split along the seams, the team located Elizabeth I's case. It had fared worse. The molten pressure of 260 years had warped the metal. Soft lead had melted just enough to fuse compartments together, locking bones and relics in a deadly embrace. When they pried it open fully, they encountered a sight that defied belief. Tissue and bodily fluids, once preserved by unguents, had congealed with decayed herbs into a tar-like mass, glistening black in the lantern light. Small fragments of flesh clung to jagged bone fragments, and the smell, oh, the unbearable smell, filled every corner of the chamber, as if the very stones had absorbed and now exhaled the horrors of that sealed tomb. The skull of Elizabeth I, once emblematic of regal beauty, was reduced to shattered fragments. The wax funerary mask, painstakingly sculpted to recapture her queenly visage, had sagged and collapsed into the cranial cavity, exposing a mouthful of brittle, pitch-black teeth. Deep cavities where the eyes ought to have been gaped like twin caverns, and atop the remains sat a tuft of crimson hair, her famous wig, its vibrant hue, the last vestige of a once magnificent splendour. In that moment, the assembled scholars beheld the macabre relic of a queen's vanity turned to grotesque mockery. Yet it was the queen's heart that proved the most astonishing find. For 2 centuries it had lain enshrined in a small lead casket, thought to be lost or destroyed. Now, as the lead was carefully cut away, there emerged a dark, translucent crystal of deep garnet hue. Microscopic analysis later revealed that elemental mercury and lead, combined with residual organic compounds from the embalming process, had initiated a slow alchemical transformation, forging the heart tissue into a jewel-like mass. This crystal heart glittered in the lonely torchlight, a dreadful gem of sovereign flesh that bore witness to the chilling intersection of power, pride, and posthumous decay. Equally perplexing was evidence of what the Victorian scientists would term recursive putrefaction. Rather than decaying in one linear progression, portions of the corpse had fossilized into hardened deposits, only to liquefy again when exposed to moisture, and then resolidify as the environment dried. This cycle had repeated countless times, trapping the remains in a morbid dance of dissolution and reconstitution. The result was a complex stratigraphy of organic and inorganic layers, mummified skin interspersed with gelatinous pockets, desiccated organs embedded within resinous plugs, and bone fragments enmeshed in translucent films of crystallized tissue. The revelation of recursive putrefaction sent shockwaves through the fields of archaeology and early forensic science. Scholars realized that burial in sealed metal containers could induce chemical reactions far more dynamic and unpredictable than previously imagined. Consequently, the study of human remains in enclosed environments became a priority for those eager to prevent similar tragedies. Mortuary practitioners, too, took heed. Innovations in coffin design, the use of breathable materials, and the elimination of caustic embalming agents were adopted to avert future buildups of toxic gases and recursive decay cycles. Meanwhile, the uncanny crystal heart became the focus of urgent research. Chemists, anatomists, and embalmers convened at London's Royal College of Surgeons to unlock the secret of its formation. Their analyses confirmed that mercury sulfide, lead chloride, and complex organic polymers had fused under low oxygen conditions, creating a unique mineral composite. This discovery spurred investigations into the long-term stability of embalmed tissues, the dangers posed by heavy metals in burial practices, and even the potential for safely preserving forensic samples over decades. In the decades that followed, museums and academic institutions around Europe displayed fragments of Elizabeth's embalming materials, her masking wax, the pungent herbs, and tiny shards of the crystal heart cautioned by curators to be handled with extreme care. These relics served not only as historical curiosities but as poignant reminders. The quest to honor and memorialize the dead must be tempered by humility before the unstoppable forces of nature. Thus, the 1868 excavation of Westminster Abbey did more than expose the grisly fate of a Tudor queen. It transformed our understanding of death, preservation, and decay. What had been a closely guarded, ghastly secret became a cornerstone of modern mortuary science. And, in the quiet hush of hallowed vaults, one could almost hear the faint whisper of Elizabeth's own lament. That power, however great, is ultimately powerless against the relentless chemistry of mortality. Part 3. The impact of the Westminster Abbey excavation on the Victorian royal court was nothing short of seismic. When Queen Victoria herself, no stranger to the rituals of mourning and fascinated by the solemn pageantry of funerary custom, received Bishop Arthur Stanley's private report, she was said to have been visibly shaken. No longer content with the elaborate weeks-long embalming ceremonies of her Tudor predecessors, she immediately decreed a sweeping simplification of royal mortuary practices. Gone would be the days of mercury-laced unguents and lead-lined caskets that trapped spores and gases in a cauldron of decay. Instead, the new protocol mandated rapid interment bodies to be buried in well-ventilated coffins within hours of death, and the outright elimination of toxic preservatives such as mercury and lead. The aim was clear: to minimize bacterial proliferation and prevent the build-up of pressurized putrefactive gases that had turned Elizabeth I's final resting place into a chemical trapdoor of horror. Across London and beyond, the scientific community reeled in response. At the University of London, Cambridge, and Oxford, professors of chemistry and medicine began to offer specialized lectures in toxicology as applied to post-mortem care. Courses on the chemical analysis of tissues, once confined to rudimentary anatomical study, expanded to include modules on heavy metal interactions, resin chemistry, and the fluid dynamics of gas accumulation in sealed environments. Medical faculties introduced new laboratories where students could perform controlled experiments on animal specimens, observing firsthand how the absence of ventilation and the presence of caustic compounds accelerated or inhibited various stages of decomposition. The field of mortuary science, once relegated to the margins of medical education, found itself elevated to a discipline of crucial importance, with research grants pouring in from government bodies keen to prevent any repeat of the Tudor nightmare. A particularly striking lesson emerged from these studies. The more elaborate and chemically intensive the embalming ritual, the greater the risk of recursive putrefaction. When embalmed tissues were sealed in airtight containers and infused with multiple layers of resinous mixtures and metallic salts, they did not simply decompose in a single linear progression. Rather, those tissues would alternately desiccate, spoil, and desiccate again in an endless cycle, a phenomenon that researchers came to term iterative decay. Iterative decay had been the invisible engine behind the ghastly crystal heart of Elizabeth I, the splitting of her skull, and the tar-black resin that bound her bones. Recognizing this, Victorian embalmers began to adopt far simpler formulas, relying on cotton wadding, dry salts, and natural oils with minimal toxicity. Embalming times were cut from days to mere hours, and coffins were fitted with small vents to allow gases to escape, an almost heretical innovation compared to the ritualistic oaths of silence once sworn by court surgeons. Meanwhile, a new legend began to ripple through London's fog-shrouded streets. The legend of the voices beneath the stones. It was said that on the quietest of nights, when the abbey's lanterns flickered and the wind rustled the nave's ancient draperies, one could hear the subtle hiss of trapped air escaping from fissures in the vault floor. Occasionally, a faint thudding, like a suppressed heartbeat, would reverberate up through the stone, as though some restless spirit was shifting in its leaden tomb. Parishioners and visitors alike reported these uncanny sounds to the abbey authorities. Official clergy explanations pointed to breeding rats in the crypt, or to the natural expansion and contraction of stone under temperature changes. Yet countless believers maintained that such mundane explanations failed to account for the distinctly human cadence of the noises. In hushed whispers, they insisted that it was the voice of Elizabeth I herself, still unsettled after centuries, her legacy refusing to lie silent in the pitch-black corridors below. Despite these rumours and the palpable tension that lingered around the abbey, the church authorities were determined to preserve both sanctity and order. The abbey retained its air of solemn veneration, though now tinged with a sotto voce thrill of the uncanny. Visitors arriving in droves to see its soaring arches, stained glass windows, and royal effigies soon found themselves confiding tales of ghostly murmurings to their friends back home. The guides, trained to maintain a respectful tone, would offer a cautious disclaimer. Yes, there have been reports of strange sounds, but they are likely nothing more than natural phenomena. Still, the abbey's reputation as a locus of both sacred memory and eerie mystery only deepened. Social gatherings in genteel drawing rooms often revolved around recounted experiences. Have you heard the faint tapping near the East Crypt? Or, my friend swears she heard a whisper while kneeling at the shrine of Edward the Confessor. And so the narrative of Elizabeth I's posthumous saga became a favourite anecdote at tea parties and debating societies alike. Historians wove the excavation into lectures on the perils of unchecked ambition, while poets composed elegies that imagined the Queen's spirit wandering her own stone halls. Each telling emphasized different details: the crystalline heart, the fused coffins, the echoes of the dead. But common to all was the undercurrent of sleep-inducing dread, the gentle lure of terror softened by the comforting notion that such horrors belonged to another age. For in Victorian England, facing the sublime and the grotesque was as much a pastime as attending the opera or visiting the new wax museums, and the abbey's whispered secrets offered the perfect blend of historical gravitas and ghostly chill. Yet, through it all, Westminster Abbey remained fundamentally unchanged, a place of worship and remembrance, consecrated ground where monarchs and paupers alike found their final repose. The abbey's caretakers continued to maintain its chapels and cloisters, its choir stalls and memorial tablets. Pilgrims knelt at the tombs of saints, reciting prayers under softly glowing lamps. Choirs practiced the solemn chants of evensong, filling the rafters with sonorous harmonies that seemed to repel the faintest echo from below. The abbey stood as a testament to endurance. Stone walls that had weathered Norman sieges, civil wars, and the passage of nearly a millennium, now holding within them a sealed vault of terror and revelation. Thus, the tale of Elizabeth I's vault entered the tapestry of Victorian lore, a cautionary thread woven through the grand narrative of empire and progress. Even as science and ceremony evolved, even as the use of lethal metals in embalming fell into disfavour, the abbey's underground secret persisted. It lingered in the patient drip of condensation, in the slight draught through a crypt door, in the last, sleepy hour before dawn, when the world seems to hold its breath. For those who knew the story well, every creak in a wooden pew, every low murmur in a corridor, carried a silent reminder that no matter how swiftly one might seek to consign the dead to rest, the echoes of their passage endure, soft and remorseless, in the very stones beneath our feet. Part 4. In bridging the gap between the Tudor past and the dawn of Victorian science, the exhumation of Elizabeth I wrought a reverberation felt across 2 centuries. As 16th century tomb technology met 19th century chemistry labs, scholars realized that death need not be a silent endpoint, but could instead spark an ongoing drama of molecular transformation. The concept of recursive putrefaction emerged from this union of eras, a phrase coined to describe the corpse's alternating cycles of ossification and decay when sealed within a lead coffin. Rather than decomposing in a straight line, the remains reformed into hardened deposits, only to liquefy again when moisture seeped in, then ossify once more as it dried. This endless loop of biochemical reactions became a cornerstone of forensic inquiry, and changed the way anatomists, chemists, and mortuary specialists viewed the final chapter of human life. Long after the initial shock of discovery, laboratories across London and beyond conducted controlled experiments that mimicked the Abbey's conditions. Animal specimens embalmed with simplified Victorian formulas were placed in miniature lead frames to observe their fate over many months. Each cycle of drying and wetting produced new strata of crystallized fats, resin plugs, and bone shards, offering tangible proof that the sealed environment functioned as both seal and cauldron. Infrared spectroscopy and early X-ray imaging revealed layers of organic residue interleaved with metallic salts, evidence that every molecule was engaged in an elaborate chemical dance. By the time modern forensic textbooks codified these findings, the phrase lead vault loop had become shorthand for a subject that was once taboo: the living science of the dead. This unsettling knowledge prompted a re-examination of the Shakespearean notion that there's no slumber in the tomb. Instead of eternal rest, the vault held a restless laboratory where time reanimated decay in perpetual rotation. The wider public, once content with hushed whispers about embalming secrets, now grappled with a profound question. If a sovereign could not escape the relentless cycle of life and death, what hope remained for any mortal? Elizabeth herself had sought power over her mortality through elaborate mummification rites, white lead masks, vermilion paints, and perfumed resins meant to hold back the inevitable. And yet, centuries later, her body had become both victim and testament to the chemical laws she could not command. From this revelation emerged a sobering lesson. Grandeur fades before the inexorable logic of nature. The sprawling palaces, the ornate state portraits, and even the bloody victories against foreign fleets could not forestall the dissolution of flesh. The Queen's ruby-coloured crystal heart, a byproduct of elemental mercury, lead, and her own blood, shone as a morbid jewel of vanity. It embodied the paradox of seeking permanence through mortal means, a gemstone of decay, beautiful yet poisonous, transient yet eternal in its deterrent power. Scholars spoke of it in hushed tones, as if the very mention of its existence risked summoning the ghostly echo of Tudor pomp. In classrooms and courtrooms, the Abbey's lessons became metaphors for the impermanence of authority. Legal scholars compared the cycles of decay to the rise and fall of dynasties, noting that power, like tissue, could briefly petrify into a semblance of immortality before crumbling under unseen pressures. Philosophers argued that the crystal heart was not merely a curiosity, but a mirror held up to human ambition. Every empire, Roman, Ottoman, British, would one day find its monuments eroded by time's slow chemistry. Poets wove the imagery into elegies that traced the arc from crown to cinder, each verse a lullaby to the sleeping dead, and a reminder that all flesh eventually returns to dust. And so, as candlelight flickers through the great windows of Westminster Abbey, one can almost sense the slow hum of molecular unrest beneath the stone floor. The vault remains sealed, yet its story resonates through the centuries. A solemn dirge for the permanence we crave, and the decay we cannot deny. In a world that exalts triumph and glory, the tale of Elizabeth I stands as a final, sleep-inducing whisper that in the end, every body, every empire, every heart of crimson jewel, yields to the gentle insistence of nature's chemistry, dissolving into the same elemental song from which all life once arose. Part 5. The story of Elizabeth I beyond her death has become a timeless cautionary emblem. None, neither king nor queen, can elude the inexorable cycle of birth, decay, sickness, and death. In the ancient stones and weathered bricks of Westminster Abbey, it is said that every grain of dust still carries a trace of her ephemeral spirit once hailed as the mother of a golden age, now dispersed into the very air and mineral walls that enshrine her memory. As sunlight filters through stained glass, illuminating the nave in muted hues, one can almost feel the faint echo of her pulse lingering in each silent recess, a reminder that what was once living must inevitably merge with the elemental world. In this vision of regal inevitability, Elizabeth becomes part of the atmosphere itself. Her flesh, once sculpted in portraits and immortalized in verse, now exists in subtle whispers of gas and microcrystals woven through the abbey's fabric. Visitors who pause beneath the soaring vaults may sense a delicate resonance between life and death, between sovereignty and emptiness. The sculpted effigies of monarchs, lining the chapels, seem to inhale that same spectral breath, as if the hearts of all who rest here share a common destiny, to return slowly to the mix of stone, air, and shadow. Such reflections invite each generation to live within its own boundaries, to leave behind deeds of genuine worth rather than seek ephemeral dominion. For Elizabeth I attempted to master her own mortality through ritual and early scientific methods, lead coffins, toxic unguents, and secret embalming formulas. But in the end she watched her ambitions dissolve into refuse. That paradox, the Queen's final lesson, is that sanctifying power and venerating death both fail against the unyielding law of nature. The same chemistry that once fortified her remains, ultimately reclaimed them, rendering her elaborate rites impotent before elemental forces. Across the Abbey's hallowed corridors, scholars, poets, and pilgrims alike have paused to consider this paradox. Philosophers of the modern age refer to Elizabeth's posthumous fate in lectures on mortality and the fragility of human constructs. They speak of her lead-lined casket as an allegory for our own attempts to bottle time, to seal away truths we dare not face. And though her story is deeply rooted in 16th century pomp, its resonance speaks to 21st century souls who grapple with the impermanence of identity in an ever-changing world. Musicians have composed solemn requiems that linger on prolonged chords, evoking the slow drip of water through vault stones, a metronome of decay paced by the heartbeat of centuries. Visual artists have incorporated specks of ancient dust and fractured shards of resin from Elizabeth's chamber into mixed-media installations, allowing audiences to confront the physical remnants of her vanished empire. Even in digital forums, the phrase "dust of queens" circulates as a metaphor for the humility required in leadership. Build with conviction. Yes, but remember that every edifice is born to crumble. Yet, for all its sobering truths, the legend of Elizabeth in the Abbey is not merely a dirge. There is a strange solace in knowing that each of us, bound by the same formula of atoms and time, shares in this grand, cyclical transformation. In that recognition, power loses its veneer of invincibility, replaced by a shared sense of vulnerability that fosters compassion. If Elizabeth I, who commanded armies and penned her own eulogies, could not shield herself from the chemistry of decomposition, then perhaps we too may learn humility and extend mercy to those who follow. As candlelight flickers in the chapels at dusk, the Abbey's guardians extinguish the electric bulbs one by one, ushering in a hush that feels almost sacred. In the final glow, a hush descends, a quiet awakening of memory and mortality entwined. The stones exhale centuries of prayers and regrets, and the Abbey stands not only as a monument to power but as a sanctuary for contemplation. Here, among shadows and omens, we are invited to lay down our illusions of permanence and embrace the gentle wisdom of our fleeting breath. Thus, in the stillness where Elizabeth's essence mingles with the dust, the ultimate message emerges: strive to leave a legacy of kindness and truth, for all other monuments will one day give way to the earth's patient embrace. Each step on the limestone floor echoes this ancient lesson, that glory, no matter how glittering, will yield to the same quiet decay that cradles all life. And in that knowledge, we find a final peace, knowing that in the soft return to dust, we become part of something far larger than any crown or kingdom. Part 6. When Elizabeth I drew her last breath on the morning of March 24th, 1603, at precisely 3 o'clock before dawn, The hush that settled over Richmond Palace was both solemn and expectant. Only a handful of her attendants remained, a mix of loyal ladies in waiting and duty-bound servants supporting her trembling legs as she slipped from this world. In that final, fragile moment, her body ceased to belong to herself. Even as grief and ritual vied for dominance in the cold chamber, a discreet team of surgeons and embalmers stood at the ready, their instruments arrayed like surgical tools in a dimly lit theatre. The implements were formidable. A gleaming steel scalpel, long metal rods for probing, slender hooks for grasping slippery flesh, and shallow buckets to catch each severed fragment. Under the tremulous glow of failing candles, the first incision commenced. A horizontal cut below the ribs sliced through skin and tissue, and a surge of stale, herbed air escaped in a wet hiss. The unique stench was a pungent blend of damp candle smoke and centuries-old spices, rosemary, frankincense, and myrrh, fused into a scent that clung to the nostrils like an unwelcome memory. As the surgeons slid their blades deeper, they displaced organs with careful precision, extracting the queen's heart, liver, and womb to examine for any sign of the royal disease, or to touch upon the persistent rumours of her virginity. Each removed organ was placed into its own small lead casket, sealed to preserve what tissue remained, while questions of health, lineage, and rumour were silently recorded by scriveners in hastily assembled ledgers. The extraction of Elizabeth's brain was perhaps the most clinical of cruelties. A long, slender iron rod was inserted through one nostril, pressing against the fragile base of the skull. Minute fractures ensued, as the surgeons gently rocked the rod back and forth until the bone splintered, yielding to the modern equivalent of a trepanation. They then coaxed the once vibrant brain out in a series of greyish clots, each one yielding to gravity into the waiting basin. The attendants shuddered, but continued their task in mechanical silence, for duty, or perhaps dread, left little room for compassion. Once the cavities were emptied, the body was cleansed in successive baths of red wine and wine vinegar. Though intended to purge bacteria, the rinse only drove moisture into the empty shell, elevating internal pressure within the lead-lined coffin that would become her final abode. Following the washes, the surgeons filled the hollow torso with a fabled blend of aromatic substances: ground sandalwood, dried rose petals, pounded cedar sawdust, and handfuls of eucalyptus sprigs. These materials, once prized for their preservative qualities, created a compact, resinous core that would later congeal into a dark mass, an early alchemical tableau of body-meeting chemistry. The final phase of preparation transformed Elizabeth's corpse into a macabre art object. Incisions were skillfully sewn, with cumbersome steel needles and thick linen thread, closing the queen's flesh as seamlessly as possible under the faint candlelight. The face was then modelled in cold wax and plaster to recapture the regal countenance lost to rigor mortis and the ravages of age. Artisans meticulously applied layers of white lead paint and vermilion to suggest the rosy complexion she once wore. Finally, they fitted a crimson wig atop her sculpted skull, its rich locks arranged as if to frame a crown that no longer rested on her brows. As day broke over London, the grand procession commenced. A vast cortege moved through the misty streets. Footmen in velvet cloaks, torchbearers whose flames struggled against the damp air, and solemn guards whose boots struck the cobbles in measured cadence. The hearses themselves were imposing. A carriage draped in deep black velvet, its wheels cushioned to muffle any harsh jolt, bearing atop it a life-sized wax effigy of the Queen. The figure's eyes were closed in serene repose, her hands folded in prayer, and her lips curved almost imperceptibly in a final, eternal smile. To the crowds lining the route, the tableau was one of dignity and grace, yet all the while, the coffin beneath that delicate effigy housed a body still at war with itself, its inner chemistry churning in a sealed prison. Upon arrival at Westminster Abbey, the coffin was lowered into the subterranean vault, into the same confined space that already held the lead coffin of Mary Tudor, Elizabeth's half-sister and rival. The weight of 2 centuries pressed down in layers of lead and stone. As the mourners watched, a soft rumble emerged from the darkness below, like the faintest growl of a great beast stirring in its slumber. Some whispered that this was merely the sound of the coffin giving way under pressure, or of air escaping from microscopic fissures. Others claimed it was the restless spirit of one or both queens, their souls still unsettled after centuries of contention. Without hesitation, gravediggers shoveled earth into the crypt, insisting that the strange noises cease once the final mound of clay sealed the chamber. Yet within days, reports began to surface. A faint tapping at the vault door, a low hum reverberating when the abbey's lanterns dimmed. Church officials attributed the phenomena to natural causes, rats burrowing in the mortar, or the contraction and expansion of stone in the damp spring air. But for many of the faithful, these explanations felt too prosaic. They believed that the two queens, forever entwined in both life and death, were still struggling within their earthen tomb, their voices echoing through the dark, pleading for rest. And so the story of Elizabeth I's posthumous fate gained new layers of mythos. The ancient abbey, already woven into the fabric of English identity, now held within its foundations a secret that blurred the lines between science, ritual, and the supernatural. Pilgrims would later leave coins at the heavy oak door, seeking protection from restless spirits. Poets would pen lines about the twin queens beneath stone, and scholars would debate whether the vault's noises were mere geological quirks or the murmurs of imperishable regret. In that hush of history, as candles guttered in the abbey's vast spaces, one could almost imagine the slow, measured breathing of two royal women whose earthly contest had outlasted every crown, every decree, and every decree of God that once placed them above common mortality. Part 7. For 265 years, the sealed lead vaults housing the Tudor dynasts lay undisturbed beneath Westminster Abbey, their contents regarded as both sacred and too dreadful for mortal curiosity. Generations passed with only hushed rumours of what lay within those thick metal coffers, rumours of powdery bones and silent treasures swallowed by time. Then, in October 1868, a shift in scholarly appetite and a newfound appetite for forensic discovery converged to break the centuries-old embargo. Bishop Arthur Stanley, swayed by the momentum of archaeological revival and the rising prestige of medical jurisprudence, quietly authorized a reopening of the vaults. Yet the act proved far more complex than a mere ceremonial unsealing. First came the challenge of locating the exact resting place of the royal coffins. Rainwater, having seeped through centuries-old joints in the abbey's vaulted ceiling, had eroded the limestone corridors into a maze of cracks and loose stones. Puddles formed in uneven niches, and where once the lead-lined chests had stood solid, decay and moisture caused them to slip from their original supports. Wooden planks rotted, iron brackets corroded, and the interred sarcophagi lay toppled in a confused array, their clay-soaked contents mixing with churned earth to create a treacherous floor of ankle-deep sludge. The engineers tasked with the excavation had to reinforce weakened archways and scaffold fragile walls before any heavy lifting of metal lids could safely commence. Once deemed structurally sound, the team pressed on. The specialists wore rudimentary protective gear, thick canvas suits coated in oilcloth, simple cloth masks over their faces, and hose-like tubes leading to bellows devices that provided a flicker of forced air. With lamps swinging from their belts, they descended into the vault's gloom, only to be met by a vision that turned their blood cold. Coffins cracked open and scattered, remains of noble lineage collapsed into dank heaps, and the air was thick with the acrid tang of decay. Even the most steeled among them gagged as they navigated the narrow aisles between shattered lead and splintered wood, each step threatening to unsettle more foul substances into the dank atmosphere. At last, they reached the twin coffins of Mary Tudor and Elizabeth I, clamped together in a macabre echo of their historical rivalry. To separate them, workers employed heavy metal saws and chisels, cutting through centuries-softened lead. As each blade pierced the barrier, a chorus of hisses and rumbles erupted, the release of tightly compressed gases built up over countless seasons. The noises were uncanny, like suppressed groans of distant giants waking from a long slumber, rising through the corridors in quivering pulses that reverberated against centuries-old stone. When the lid of Elizabeth's coffin finally yielded, the lantern light revealed a sight that defied rational comfort. The once floral stuffing, a mixture of fragrant herbs and resins, had transformed into a pitch-black resinous mass. Thick, tar-like in consistency, it clung tenaciously to the coffin's walls and filled every cavity where flesh had once lain. At a glance, it might have appeared as a grotesque artifact of ritual, but on closer inspection, it was unmistakably human remains bound in a resinous embrace. Some areas of bone had survived remarkably intact, emerging from the resin in pale, chalky shards. Yet most of the skeleton had crumbled to powder, scattered in irregular clusters among torn fragments of linen wrappings. The embalmed skull of Elizabeth, once carefully concealed under a wax mask, had long since collapsed inward, crushed by the weight of the resin and the rigid lead. The wax had melted away over time, leaving only the bright red strands of the Queen's wig, now a lonely crown atop the ruin. While the physical separation continued, the forensic experts busied themselves with sampling. Small spatulas scraped fragments of the black resin, and glass vials were filled with droplets of viscous fluid that pooled in low spots on the coffin floor. Tissue remnants were cut into tiny slivers and immersed in alcohol for preservation. Each sample was meticulously labelled resin deposit, dorsal cavity, skull fragment, left temporal, wig fibre, crimson. These specimens would later be transported to laboratories where advanced chemical assays would shed light on the alchemy within. Emerging from the vault, covered in soot and resin, the investigators reported their findings with quiet awe. Early spectroscopic analysis revealed that the once aromatic substances, frankincense, sandalwood, and nutmeg, had mingled at the molecular level, with traces of mercury and lead from the embalming tinctures. Over the decades, these compounds reacted to form crystalline complexes, binding to collagen and fatty tissue to produce what they termed the posthumous heart crystal. Further examination showed layers of compound built up in concentric strata, much like the rings of a tree, each band representing a cycle of moisture, influx, and desiccation that drove the process of recursive decay. This breakthrough was hailed as a milestone in forensic history. The discovery that embalmed tissues could undergo such dynamic chemical metamorphoses reshaped protocols for both archaeological and criminal investigations. Mortuary science evolved rapidly as leaders in the field recognized the dangers posed by heavy metal embalming agents and the necessity of ventilation in newly interred coffins. Universities incorporated modules on post-mortem chemistry, and legal codices were revised to require specialized handling of sealed remains. In the years that followed, the tale of the two queenly coffins continued to reverberate. Lectures and dissertations probed the implications of the find, exploring what it meant for understanding past practices and preventing future tragedies. Meanwhile, the abbey itself, and indeed the broader public consciousness, retained a renewed sense of reverence and unease. For buried beneath the mortar and whispers, the legacy of Tudor royalty had merged irrevocably with the laws of chemistry, transforming regal mortality into a scientific parable that remained sealed in lead, yet spoke volumes to every generation that dared to listen. Part 8. The revelation of Elizabeth I's heart in crystalline form sent tremors through the learned world. What had seemed a macabre curiosity transformed into a cornerstone of modern forensic science. Early chemical assays disclosed that the very substances intended to preserve her mercury, lead, and arsenic among them had acted as catalysts for an astonishing cyclical process of decay and renewal. Researchers observed that, once infused into tissue, these heavy metals bound to proteins and lipids, forming an impenetrable shell that would then fracture under varying humidity. As moisture infiltrated the coffin, sections of the embalmed flesh liquefied like necrotic gel. When the environment dried, those same sections rehardened into a resinous crust. Day after day, month after month, this back-and-forth progression continued unchecked, earning the phenomenon the technical name recursive putrefaction. Within weeks of the abbey's excavation, universities across Britain integrated the new concept into their curricula. At the University of London, lectures in the medical school devoted entire sessions to the chemical mechanics of recursive putrefaction. Students in anatomy classes conducted demonstrations on non-human specimens, embalming organs with varying concentrations of metallic salts and observing the cycle of hardness and softening under controlled temperature and humidity conditions. Archaeology departments too took note. Teams studying tombs in Egypt, Persia, and the Americas re-evaluated earlier findings, wondering how many ancient corpses might have undergone similar cycles beneath their stone sarcophagi. In fashionable London society, whispers of the gruesome science spurred a rapid transformation in funerary customs. Embalmers began to advertise modern, chemical-free preservation, emphasizing dry salts and botanical oils in place of toxic tinctures. Coffins were redesigned with small, hidden vents, microflues, to allow gases built up during initial interments to escape gradually, preventing the pressure that had once turned Elizabeth's tomb into a sealed cauldron. Mourning manuals of the era, once bound in somber black leather, included sections on proper ventilation and the perils of over-embalming. Even Queen Victoria, whose obsession with memorial rites was well known, issued a royal decree simplifying the court's death ceremonies, explicitly forbidding the use of mercury compounds in royal preparations. Thus, the shadow of a 16th century queen reshaped 19th century protocols, prioritizing the health of attendants and the dignity of the departed over the ostentatious demonstration of permanence. Yet for all the innovations above ground, it was the subterranean murmurs that haunted the public imagination. On windy evenings, when gales swept through the abbey's spires, visitors reported hearing soft rumbles and tapping echoes emanating from the crypt below. Some claimed the sounds resembled bones shifting, or perhaps the subtle creaking of wood in long-rotated coffin lids. More fanciful souls insisted they heard faint whispers like the stirrings of a once regnant soul unwilling to rest. Tour guides, bound by propriety, cautioned against attributing the noises to spirit activity, suggesting instead the migration of rodents or the contraction of stone under temperature fluctuations. Yet many in the ornate pews, wrapped against the chill, felt a chill deeper than the evening air, a reminder that Tudor ambition and Victorian curiosity alike were powerless before the inexorable law of nature. Over time, Westminster Abbey became more than a cathedral or royal mausoleum. It assumed the role of a living repository of humanity's tension with mortality and its attempts to swallow death in proud leaden vaults. Pilgrims and tourists alike came not only to pray at the shrines of saints, but also to stand in humble witness to the limits of human engineering. Beneath the rippling reflection of stained glass, one could imagine Elizabeth's whispered lessons. That power, however dazzling, succumbs to the silent chemistry beneath every tomb. That the quest to conquer death is as old as royalty itself, yet as doomed as the flesh it seeks to preserve. And so, as candlelight fades on the abbey's polished floors, and the organ's final notes drift into the high vaults, the story of the Tudor queens lingers in memory and in moss-tinted stones. The crystal heart and its story have become instruments of both scientific insight and moral meditation. From the golden age of Elizabeth's reign to the sober laboratories of Victorian London, from the hush of midnight breezes to the bustling crowds at dawn, the abbey stands as testament to a dual truth: that glory may kindle the spirit, but only humility can teach the heart to rest. In that hush, we hear the cycle continue, an ever-turning wheel of life and death, and find perhaps the gentle comfort of our place within its quiet revolution. Part 9. The story of Elizabeth I has blossomed into an interdisciplinary focus, drawing scholars from archaeology, forensic science, chemistry, and cultural studies into a single, dimly lit chamber of inquiry. In the years following the 1868 excavation, teams have continued to extract minute soil samples and resin fragments from the vault's corners, each specimen a potential key to understanding the full scope of the so-called putrefaction loop. Archaeologists sieve through centuries, compacted earth for trace elements, mercury particles, lead oxides, arsenic salts, while forensic pathologists examine microscopic tissue remnants for collagen breakdown patterns. Analytical chemists apply gas chromatography and mass spectrometry to isolate volatile compounds once thought irretrievable, striving to map every chemical step in the corpse's transformation. These findings not only enrich our grasp of Tudor mortuary practices, but also forge the foundation for modern forensic applications, helping investigators decode the stages of human decomposition in criminal cases where sealed remains might conceal vital clues. In parallel, cultural anthropologists and folklorists have chronicled the evolution of popular legend surrounding the abbey. Stories abound of a ghostly figure gliding past stained-glass windows in the hush of night, her white form flickering like mist against candlelight. Visitors speak of pale arms emerging from the flagstones, reaching skyward in silent supplication, though scientists attribute these visions to shifting temperatures, condensation on cold stone, and subtle air currents in the crypt. The chilling allure of the supernatural narrative persists. Guided ghost tours flourish in the shadowy vaults, where guides careful to preserve a veneer of academic restraint recount eyewitness accounts with hushed reverence, blending documented fact with whispered rumor to enthrall thrill-seekers drawn to the abbey's uncanny magnetism. Recognizing both the scholarly importance and the public fascination, the abbey's custodians have tentatively opened portions of the old vault to guided exhibitions. Visitors descend narrow staircases into low-lit corridors, their path marked by faint lanterns reflecting off ancient mortar. Soft, ambient sounds, distant drip of water, muted rustle of unseen drafts provide an atmospheric underscore, heightening the sense of walking within a living memory. Only a fraction of the crypt is visible, framed by barriers that blend into shadows, ensuring that the majority of the lead-lined chambers remain sealed and undisturbed. Curators carefully select a handful of resin samples and cracked lead plates for display behind thick glass, each accompanied by explanatory plaques that emphasize the artifact's dual roles as both scientific specimens and testimonies to mortality's decree. Despite these measures, the true resting places of Elizabeth and her half-sister, Mary Tudor, remain shrouded beyond the viewer's reach. Thick walls of ancient lead now themselves, aged and oxidized, guard the bodies as surely as the abbey's stone heralds guard the tombs above. The technology of centuries past, combining the alchemy of mold prevention and ritual preservation, holds fast against modern attempts at intrusion. Within that sealed darkness, the two queens lie side by side, once rivals in life, now companions in silence, embodied symbols of a fleeting era of splendor sown into the earth. For those who contemplate the lessons hidden beneath the abbey's pavement, the vault stands as a lasting testament to the fragility of power under the impartial law of nature. No amount of lead or resin can confer true immortality. The meticulously crafted rituals, the chemical marvels of 16th century embalmers, and the elaborate grandeur of state funerals all yield, in the final calculus, to the same elemental forces that shaped and will ultimately reclaim every living form. In that understanding, modern visitors find a muted solace. The certainty that every life, from monarch to peasant, shares the same destiny of return to dust, a cycle beyond human command or exception. And so, beneath the abbey's soaring arches and within its hushed nave, the untold fate of two Tudor queens remains encoded in a leaden cipher, waiting only for the most patient of ears to discern its gentle, relentless message. In the quiet between candle flickers and among the mosaic of shadows cast by evening lamps, one can feel the heartbeat of history itself, reminding us that in the end, all are equal before the ceaseless chemistry of decay, and that true legacy lies not in resisting the tomb, but in the quiet grace with which we enter it. Part 10. As the secrets slumbering beneath Westminster Abbey's stone floors gradually unfurled, the tale of Elizabeth I began to transcend mere chronicle and assume philosophical weight. No longer confined to the rigid annals of Tudor history, her posthumous saga became a prism through which thinkers examined the fragility of fame, the very power that had echoed across the globe in her lifetime, the royal decrees, the stirring speeches, the ornate portraits now seemed but the prologue to a final act of quiet decay. Within every flagstone and flickering candle flame, one could almost hear her whispered lament, "Once I was queen, now I am but ashes." In quiet study halls and candlelit parlours, authors and artists wove her story into new forms. Historical novelists reconstructed the shadowy embalming chamber in languid prose, allowing readers to breathe in the tang of incense and steel. Documentary filmmakers, their voices steady yet hushed, dissected the precise steps of recursive putrefaction, overlaying grainy footage of ancient vaults with interviews from forensic chemists. Chamber musicians composed elegiac suites, blending basso continuo with sampled echoes of wind gusting through the abbey's arches and muted tapping that might have been bone against lead. In galleries, installations of candlelight and draped fabrics evoked the damp stillness of the crypt, inviting viewers to wander between light and shadow, life and its inevitable end. Thus, the abbey evolved into more than a monument of Gothic architecture. It became a living museum of mortality. Pilgrims came not only to pray at the shrines of saints or to admire vaulted ceilings, but to stand in silent awe before exhibits that probed the boundary between reverence and revulsion. Wooden display cases lined a section of cloistered walkway, housing fragments of Elizabeth's lead coffin, shards of red gold wig hairs, and samples of resin-blackened tissue. Small plaques, lettered in low relief, reminded visitors that His Queen once commanded an empire. Now her body whispers its final verdict to all who listen. Despite the centuries that separate us from her reign, Elizabeth I remains etched in collective memory not only as the Virgin Queen and the steadfast guardian of England, but as the ultimate emblem of a fate shared by all. Highborn or humble, each human life must bow to the same alchemy of time and chemistry. When one walks beneath the abbey's soaring nave, the hush seems to carry her presence. The distant rustle of silk gowns, the ring of a distant crown, now softened into the steady drone of remembrance. If one listens closely, the abbey itself seems to murmur an eternal truth, that authority and mortality are inseparable, that every triumph bears within it the seed of decline. And so arrives the final curtain on our subterranean odyssey beneath Westminster Abbey. A journey from glimmering pageantry to hushed mystery, from concrete record to whispered meditation. We have traced the golden arc of Elizabeth's reign, witnessed the grotesque transformation of her remains, and beheld the forging of her crystal heart. Yet beneath each revelation, a constant refrain echoes, that all must pass through the same gate, be it in velvet coronation robes or wrapped in solemn lead. In the shadowed hush of the crypt, amid the faint drip of water and the soft sigh of ancient stone, we learn that glory may gild a lifetime, but decay, in its gentle inevitability, ennobles the memory of what once was. Here, in this place of both worship and wonder, the Abbey invites us to contemplate our own fleeting breath. For whether we dwell in palaces or walk humble streets, we approach the same silent threshold. And in that shared destiny, there lies a subtle comfort, an unspoken kinship that binds us across centuries, binding Elizabeth I to every soul that pauses to hear her final, sleep-steeped lesson, that in yielding to the earth's embrace, we become part of a story as old as time itself. Part 11. After the unsettling exhumation of 1868 drew to a close, Bishop Arthur Stanley ordered the Tudor vault to be sealed once more. The heavy lead lids were carefully lowered, metal edges pressing together with a finality that seemed to mute the echoes of drips and distant rattles. Yet Stanley's private report, meticulously penned in a tremulous hand, described scenes that no official statement could capture. He spoke of a charnel house of monarchy, where bone shards lay embedded in mire, and the primitive breathing apparatus failed utterly to keep the stench of decay at bay. Some members of the excavation party, he recorded, turned pale and wretched the moment they stepped beneath the vault's arched entry. Most disquieting was Stanley's account of the two lead coffins fused by pressure and heat over centuries. The soft, pliable lead of Elizabeth's and Mary's chests had melded at the seams, creating a solid mass that groaned and creaked when the team finally pried them apart. He likened the sound to the wrathful rumble of ages past, a dire warning from a time long buried. Though unsettling, these grim particulars laid the groundwork for modern forensic archaeology. By studying the interaction between decaying tissue and sealed environments, specialists came to understand how gases accumulate, how heavy metals catalyze chemical reactions, and how careful documentation could transform a grotesque spectacle into vital scientific knowledge. Knowledge that would one day guide investigators at crime scenes involving concealed or sealed remains. As news of Stanley's report finally surfaced more than a century later, its impact on the British nobility echoed that of a thunderbolt. Queen Victoria herself, ever fascinated by funeral rites and the macabre pageantry of death, read the confidential manuscript with mounting alarm. Within days, she issued royal mandates to overhaul court mortuary procedures. The time between death and burial was to be drastically shortened. Mercury compounds were banned from all embalming mixtures, and ventilation of caskets became a mandatory precaution. Court surgeons and coffin makers were summoned for intensive training in what we would now call biosafety protocols. They learned to don protective gloves, to sanitize tools between bodies, and to treat heavily decomposed remains with specialized solvents rather than simple vinegar rinses. Medical schools, meanwhile, introduced courses in thanatotoxicology, ensuring that future physicians would understand the hazards of occupational exposure to toxic preservatives. These measures, unprecedented in scale and urgency, signaled a new era in the handling of the dead, one born of a horror that Victorian England could not ignore. Meanwhile, the legend of the Abbey's vault took on an almost supernatural life of its own. Londoners whispered of midnight tremors in the crypt, as if the earth itself shifted to the rhythm of some unseen heartbeat. On still evenings, the sighing of ancient stone seemed to mimic a lonely breath. and shadows cast by flickering lanterns appeared to dance like pale hands clawing at the edges of daylight. Guides began to remark, in a voice hushed to a conspiratorial whisper, that many who lingered too long near the heavy oak door claimed to feel a gentle pull, as if drawn into the darkness. Though scholars explained much of these phenomena as simple rodent activity, thermal contraction, or acoustics in vaulted masonry, the more poetic insisted it was the restless spirit of Elizabeth I, still vigilant over her leaden tomb, seeking the peace that denial of her final rest had denied her. The morbid allure of the secret in the leaden tomb spurred a small craze in popular entertainment. At the turn of the 20th century, traveling cinematographers capitalized on public fascination by producing silent horror shorts titled The Whisper in the Crypt and Queen of Shadows, each promising to reconstruct a glimpse of the hidden vault's terror. Audiences flocked to makeshift Nickelodeons to witness flickering, grainy reenactments of disrobing surgeons, vanishing wax masks, and the spectral form of a shadow-clad queen drifting through torchlit corridors. These films, while sensationalized, further entwined the scientific revelations with the Gothic imagination, ensuring that Elizabeth's posthumous fate would be etched into the collective psyche long after her reign had ended. Beyond legend and spectacle, the Abbey excavation prompted the birth of a new discipline: environmental archaeology. Researchers realized that the footprint of human death could extend far beyond a single body. By sampling the mortar and soil surrounding the vault, they detected elevated concentrations of lead, mercury, and arsenic remnants of embalming fluids that had leached into the stone itself. Core samples from bricks adjacent to the crypt showed mercury levels several times higher than modern safety thresholds, evidence that the toxic cocktail used to preserve the queen had seeped into the abbey's very foundations. Groundwater drawn from beneath the abbey carried microscopic traces of metallic salts, indicating that the surrounding ecosystem had absorbed the byproducts of courtly mortuary science. These findings had far-reaching implications. Economists of the day fretted over the cost of mitigating soil contamination in historical sites, while public health officials considered the potential dangers for groundskeepers and pilgrims who spent hours walking the abbey precincts. The custodians of Westminster Abbey commissioned extensive conservation work, sealing cracks in the crypt's masonry, installing impermeable barriers to halt further leaching, and deploying discrete ventilation shafts to expel residual gases. Meanwhile, universities established joint programs in environmental remediation and heritage preservation, training professionals to assess and restore sites tainted by the very legacies they sought to honor. Thus, the vault that held two Tudor queens became a lesson in paradox. The desire to immortalize the dead had nearly poisoned the living. In the painstaking decades since the fateful dig of 1868, historians, chemists, archaeologists, and conservationists have worked in concert to balance respect for the past with regard for future generations. The leaden chamber beneath the abbey remains sealed, a silent testament to the price of hubris and the resilience of science in unraveling even the most stubborn of mysteries. And so, the chilling saga of Elizabeth I's posthumous odyssey endures, its reverberations felt not only in lecture halls and laboratories, but also in every careful step along the abbey's ancient flags. Each brick, each shard of resin-blackened lead, stands as a quiet sentinel against forgetfulness, a reminder that in seeking to master death, we must never lose sight of life's fragile, fleeting breath. Part 12. Stepping into the 20th and 21st centuries, forensic scientists have continued to unearth the faintest traces of Elizabeth's fate deep beneath Westminster Abbey. Advances in non-invasive imaging, notably computed tomography scanning, have allowed researchers to peer inside the separate lead caskets that once held her organs. To their amazement, within those slender, elongated boxes, they detected persistent deposits of dark red crystalline matter, the legendary heart crystal of Elizabeth I. This phenomenon had never been observed in any other human remains, royal or otherwise. Subsequent analysis via X-ray fluorescence and synchrotron spectroscopy revealed the precise composition of these garnet-hued stones. Tiny concentrations of mercury-tin amalgams were entwined with calcium salts, producing a mineral phase that slowly nucleated over centuries as embalming fluids reacted with residual cardiac tissue. The findings validated Bishop Stanley's gruesome diary. His descriptions, once dismissed as sensational, matched the evidence in exquisite detail. More than a historical footnote, this discovery opened new avenues in forensic toxicology, demonstrating how the presence of heavy metals in bone can indicate chronic exposure or acute poisoning. Coroners now consult spectral libraries derived from these abbey organ samples when investigating modern cases of unexplained heavy metal toxicity. Meanwhile, cultural historians have deepened our understanding of Elizabeth's posthumous symbolism. Across galleries and concert halls, creative minds have drawn upon her narrative to explore the ephemeral nature of power. In the realm of classical music, composers have woven somber cello themes, with echoing percussion to evoke the slow drip of condensation in a sealed crypt. In contemporary historical novels, authors craft scenes where Elizabeth's body merges with the abbey's stone floor, her essence permeating every flagstone, every carved gargoyle. Art installations titled Queen in Stone present sculpted wax figures partially imbued with black resin, dramatizing the moment her flesh transfused into architecture. One particularly successful exhibition, Mummy and Monarchy, held at London's Natural History Museum in the year 2010, captivated visitors with a life-sized model of Elizabeth's lead coffin, reconstructed wax effigy, and jars of resinous soil taken from the tomb. The curator's notes emphasized that these artifacts were not mere relics of royalty, but relics of human mortality, reminders that even the grandest palaces yield to the same forces that govern blade-sharp decomposition. Over 300,000 guests toured the show, lingering before vitrines containing fragments of the heart crystal and handwritten excerpts from Stanley's secret journal. Yet as enthusiasm for such displays swelled, so too did a quieter, more thoughtful debate about the ethics of studying royal remains. Some scholars and public voices argued for the undisturbed repose of those interred, insisting that curiosity must never override the sanctity of eternal rest. They advocated for a moratorium on further sampling, claiming that royal status carries a form of inherited dignity that outlasts scientific utility. According to this view, the abbey's lead doors should remain sealed forever, preserving the sacred hush that Elizabeth and Mary Tudor were intended to keep. Conversely, a majority in the scientific and archaeological communities contended that the potential benefits of continued study outweighed the urge for absolute preservation. They argued persuasively that insights gleaned from Elizabeth's tomb, particularly the elucidation of the recursive putrefaction cycle, hold direct relevance for contemporary forensic investigations. In incidents where bodies are recovered from sealed environments, such as shipwrecks or spelunking accidents, understanding how tissues morph under prolonged anoxia can guide both identification and cause of death determinations. Moreover, they pointed out that without occasional, carefully controlled sampling, the opportunity to refine mortuary protocols and public health safeguards might be irretrievably lost. To address these tensions, an interdisciplinary oversight committee was established in the early 2020s, comprising forensic anthropologists, bioethicists, ecclesiastical representatives, and conservation architects. Their charter stipulated that any future research must meet stringent criteria, minimal invasiveness, demonstrable scientific merit, and the highest respect for the deceased. All proposals undergo rigorous ethical review, with findings reported transparently to both the academic community and the public. This framework has already authorized a handful of microdrillings to extract minute crystal cores from secondary caskets, and shallow soil corings that track mercury runoff into the abbey's foundations, all conducted under watchful scrutiny and with ceremonial blessing from the Dean. In living memory, the crypt beneath Westminster Abbey has thus come to embody an evolving dialogue between past and present, between reverence and inquiry. The dark corridors no longer resonate only with the faint drip of water, but with the hum of spectrometers, the tap-tap of drill bits, and if one listens closely, the whispered debate over how best to honor those who rest below. Elizabeth I's journey from triumphant monarch to crystallized enigma continues to teach us that the boundary between science and sanctity is not fixed, but negotiated anew by every generation. And so, in the subtle vibration of modern instruments and the muted footsteps of midnight researchers, we find the next chapter of her story unfolding. The heart crystal glimmers still in its leaden sheath, a testament to both human ingenuity and human frailty. Through the prism of museums and laboratories, of lectures and whispered legend, The vault endures as a singular testament to the fragile triumph of mortality over monarchy. In that quiet succession of discovery and contemplation, we learn once more that every age must chart its own path between the solemn hush of the crypt and the restless pulse of scientific curiosity. Part 13. On the surface, the exhumation of Elizabeth I appears as a convergence of archaeology and chemistry, but its ripples run far deeper, stirring the philosophical bedrock of how humans perceive life and death. From the political realism of Thomas Hobbes to the existential reflections of Viktor Frankl, countless thinkers have seized upon Elizabeth's posthumous saga to illustrate a stark principle: humanity is composed of matter, and consciousness returns to matter. There is, these philosophers argue, no undying soul to transcend the grave, only the slow disintegration of flesh into earth. In this light, the grotesque transformation of her body, from regal form to crystallized decay, becomes emblematic of a universe indifferent to human longing for permanence. Modern psychologists, too, have probed the dark mirror of Elizabeth's tomb to understand thanatophobia, the fear of death. They contend that public horror at hearing of a queen's corpse liquefying in its own unguents reflects a deeper unease about the infinite expanse of time and the fragility of the self. At the 2015 British Psychology Conference, researchers presented studies showing that exposure to guarded royal remains can trigger a self-protective response. While the terror of total annihilation is temporarily heightened, over time subjects report a diminished craving for literal immortality and, paradoxically, a stronger desire to lead a life of genuine meaning. In other words, confronting the ultimate fate of a storied monarch can recalibrate our priorities, focusing attention on actions that matter rather than on the vain pursuit of unending existence. Artists, inspired by these revelations, have rendered the melting royalty motif in myriad forms. Painters smear oil across canvases to depict Elizabeth's visage as petrified flesh cracking into ochre and umber fissures. Sculptural installations fuse beeswax with resinous adhesives, exuding a faintly sour, sulfuric aroma that evokes the stench of centuries-old decay. One avant-garde troupe, the Performative Collective, staged an immersive experience titled Tudor Doomsday, inviting audiences to don charcoal-filtered masks and traverse a dim labyrinth. Actors, their faces caked in alabaster makeup and darkened veins, enacted a bleak funeral rite, murmuring archaic prayers through cracked lips as they carried mock coffins draped in shredded velvet. The effect was suffocatingly intimate, a visceral reminder that the rituals meant to honor the dead can also exercise or intensify the living's dread. In literature, Elizabeth's post-mortem legend has permeated the realms of fantasy and Gothic horror. British author Neil Gaiman wove a short tale wherein the Queen's mummy rises to speak wrathful truths to complacent heirs, demanding they heed the cycles of power and decay. Japanese manga master Junji Ito sketched a nightmare in which a resin-encased Elizabeth skeleton stirs within a family crypt, its spectral voice echoing through abandoned corridors. In these stories, the decayed yet potent body becomes an avatar of vengeance and warning. No throne is stable, no dynasty immune to the grave's dominion. Across these philosophical, psychological, and artistic explorations, Elizabeth I's fate serves as both catalyst and caution. Her shattered wax mask and crystallized heart remind us that prestige and remembrance, however grand, cannot outwit the chemistry of entropy. Instead, her plight underscores a richer message: to find purpose not in defying mortality, but in embracing the fleeting beauty of our finite breath. As the world continues to turn beneath the silent arches of Westminster Abbey, the sleep-steeped lesson lingers. In the end, we are all bound for the same restful dissolution, and it is within that shared journey that our truest legacy unfolds. And so, as our journey through the silent vaults and the slow dance of decay draws gently to a close, let us let our thoughts soften like the last embers of a dying fire, the vivid imagery of leaden coffins and crystallized hearts fading into a calm, dim twilight. Take a slow, deep breath, feeling the weight of centuries lift from your shoulders as you imagine the soaring arches of Westminster Abbey bathed in moonlight, each stone exhaling centuries of stories into the still night air. In that hushed moment, we find the true message of Elizabeth's final fate, not one of horror, but of humble connection. Her story reminds us that no matter how resplendent our accomplishments, our triumphs or titles, at the end we all return to the same quiet earth. It is in this return that we discover our shared humanity, the delicate web of life that binds each of us to the next. The grandest empire is but a fleeting breath, and yet in every breath we take, there is the chance to live with kindness, to build legacies of warmth rather than walls of stone. Allow your mind to drift now, like a feather carried by a soft breeze, leaving behind the weight of regal intrigue and the echo of distant footsteps in shadowed corridors. Let the faintest memory of candlelight and whispered chants dissolve into the gentle tapestry of your own evening, where lamp glow and comfortable silence await. Remember that, though Elizabeth's story is anchored in lead and ritual, its heartbeat resonates in our own lives, urging us to cherish each moment, to honor those we hold dear, and to find solace in the knowledge that impermanence need not be feared, but embraced as the very essence of what it means to be alive. And now, with your eyelids growing heavy and your thoughts drifting towards softest dreams, I bid you a peaceful night's rest. May your sleep be calm, your dreams gentle, and your heart unburdened. If you have enjoyed this glimpse into history's hidden echoes, please subscribe to our channel, so that with each new video, each new whispered tale, you may continue to wander through the corridors of the past, ever curious, ever comforted. Good night, and sleep well.